So I've put that on as well as part of my social media. So huge thank you, Hayley, for that. It was an honour to be introduced by you in that way. So, and you would be in my university as well, so we can set it up after this meeting. And if you know me, it's all tech, so. And now it won't open. Now it's broken, so there we go. Okay, is that all working now? So you don't know the title beforehand, so it's always good to unveil this. So a few thank yous to me. Thank you to BERA and the PESP for this incredible honour. My first BERA was in Cardiff in 2005 as a master's student. I was given one day off, so I had to drive from Yorkshire to Cardiff. I arrived at midnight, I got up the next day, did a lecture, got back in the car at 4 o'clock and drove back and taught the next day. So it was one of those experiences. My first BERA as an academic was when I was actually in Manchester in 2009. So I'm very grateful to be here, and I hope you're going to enjoy this. But I hope it's going to challenge me, so I'm going to start. So, the ghosts of research past, present and future. Understanding the past to inform a future of models-based practice research. In the inaugural scholar lecture, Mary O'Sullivan wrote that the Special Interest Group for Physical Education and Sport Pedagogy, a member of the British Educational Research Association, hosts the Invisible College held each year prior to the main BERA conference and at the same venue. So we've managed that, which is good. 12 years later, I haven't turned this on, that'll be why it's not working, so you should have got that first, there we go. So 12 years later, a great friend of mine, Anne McPhail, wrote that a scholar lecture with the intent of advancing scholarly thinking is delivered by a scholar who is recognised as making a distinguished contribution to the PESP research community and provides an opportunity for participants at the Invisible College to listen and debate a variety of issues pertinent to the PESP research community. Somehow the singular honour of presenting the 2024 Scholar Lecture has been bestowed upon me. In taking up this mantle, I acknowledge the incredible scholars who have stood here before me and thank each and every one for their contribution to the field and recognise that I am, in the words of Sir Isaac Newton, standing on the shoulders of giants. You would, if you know my work, be surprised that my lecture did not explore models-based practice. You would also be surprised, again, if you read my work, if I did not borrow a slightly wacky title from someone else's catchphrase or a well-known idea. After all, paying the piper, seeing the trees, not just the wood, between hope and happening, it's Groundhog Day, I just remember rugby, all feature in my back catalogue. For my scholar lecture, therefore, I have drawn on Charles Dickens's much-loved novel, A Christmas Carol, as a fulcrum around which I have based my discussions this morning. For those who don't know, A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens follows Ebenezer Scrooge, a miserly old man who despises Christmas. On Christmas Eve, he is visited by the ghost of his former business partner, Jacob Marley. And these three ghosts three spirits representing Christmas past, present and future. These visits reveal the impact of Scrooge's actions on others and the bleak future that awaits him if he doesn't change. Moved by these visions, Scrooge transforms into a generous, kind-hearted man, embracing the spirit of Christmas and improving the lives of those around him. Particularly, I've used the ghost of Jacob Marley to predict the arrival of three spirits, and therefore the three sections of this lecture. Dickens, through Marley, foretells that Scrooge will be haunted by these spirits. By three spirits, the ghosts of Christmas past, present and future, and states that, without their visits, said the ghost, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls 1. Expect the second on the next night at the same hour. The third upon the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more, and look that, for your own sake, you remember what has passed between us. In preparing for this lecture, and in being mindful that I do not simply stumble into the next decade or more of my career without due consideration, I was persuaded, like Scrooge, to face the ghosts of my research past and consider how it affects my present and future self and the possibilities of direction of travel. Unlike Scrooge, however, I am not faced with a telling of my future. Instead, I am faced with the echoes of myself in the research I have published. The doppelgangers of myself who still speak with my voice a decade or more after the ink dried on that particular publication. These are the versions of me that I have cast in ink and are the voices of my research that reverberate in our community today and for a few more years, I hope. They travel and speak with my voice at the behest of others, as they themselves seek to publish works and set down their ideas in ink and pixels. This is the nature of our work and is a central facet of our rise through the academic ranks. It is, in short, a way of paying the piper and is a cost and consequence of academic advancement. That said, what happens if we change our minds? Maybe a little or maybe a lot. What happens when people take your work to tether the argument they wish to make that you didn't consider at the time of writing, or which stands in opposition to your current thinking? What happened when your ideas have outstayed their welcome in your own thinking and yet come back to haunt you as Marley haunted Scrooge? Your name can become synonymous with ideas that may endure in the PESP academic space, but which no longer carry weight in your thinking through the papers, chapters and books you subsequently write or have yet written, and the lectures you give. It was this question of what happens, coupled with a seminal event as a PESP journal reviewer, that prompted my thinking in this lecture. The ghost of research past. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, and Scrooge, starting up into a half-recumbent attitude, found himself face to face with the unearthly visitor who drew them, as close to it as I am to you now, and I am standing in the spirit at your elbow. Who and what are you? Scrooge demanded. I am the ghost of Christmas past. Long past? Inquired Scrooge, observant of its dwarfish statue. No, your past. In September 2021, I completed my first review of Fielder, BERA and Barker's paper, How Physical Education Teachers Are Positioned in Model Scholarship, a scoping review. When reading and subsequently reviewing this paper, I was caught by the myriad of ways in which my work was being used to make both similar and contrasting arguments. For context, there are 48 papers in this review, and I feel privileged to have contributed 9 of them. Given, however, this paper was looking at teachers' positioning in model scholarship, and I was the teacher in 3 of the contributing papers, I was not enamoured with how my work was being positioned. I think my first response to the authors below shows how I felt. I recommended a reject and resubmit. Sorry, Robin, where is he? Sorry. I recall that I was particularly discombobulated by the way in which one paper, in this case my 300-page Insider Action Research doctoral thesis, which looked at my journey of change from teacher-centred to student-centred practitioner, was used to make multiple points. You also use the same paper to make different arguments. For example, on page 13 you write Casey 4 provides an alternative understanding of models. If we track paper 4 through the 8 different positions of teachers you propose, then Casey argues that teachers are 1, incapable of using models correctly, 2, only capable of using models correctly with support, 3, resistant to using models, 4, needing models to change their normal practice, 5, mechanical reproducers of models, 6, adapters of models, 7, struggling implementers of models, and 8, collaborators with researchers when implementing models. then we can see reference to paper 4 in all 8 positions. Are you arguing that Casey, in his doctoral thesis, employed 8 different positions for the teachers, which in Casey's case is himself? The authors worked diligently over the next few months to adapt the paper and were able to develop what I then saw and still see as a very valuable contribution to the models literature. I was still perturbed, however, that my work was being presented without real timestamp. As I saw it, what I said in 2010 was afforded the same potential impact as the work I published in 2021. And you guessed it, I told the authors. I am concerned, as mentioned above, that you have ignored how some of the author's work has changed over time. Casey, for example, as an extensively cited author in his work, is currently used to make multiple contrasting arguments, more so than any other author. And yet there is no acknowledgement in the paper that his work, and that of others, is changing over time. I feel this is a little disingenuous. Sorry you have to relive this, Robin, I'm sorry. Disingenuous, especially as there is no consideration of the contrasting ways in which his work is presented. Historically, authors like Casey and Kirk use terms like non-negotiables, that they have developed and changed this narrative over the last 8 years, which again isn't reflected in the paper. At present, the literature is considered as a whole and is lacking in the way of nuance. I wonder if such an acknowledgement could come at the end of the paper as a limitation section or paragraph. I asked a lot of you, I'm sorry, Robert. In the published paper, Fialna et al. Appeared to accept my point, or at least were required to accept it given the power of peer review, but that is a different scholar lecture, see Kirk 2012. And they acknowledged 2 limitations. It was these limitations and my somewhat petulant review that started a thought process in me that finally comes to fruition in this lecture. Firstly, Fialna et al. Acknowledged that given the rapid development of models literature, we believe there is a need to examine how scholarship is changing and potentially providing new positions for teachers. This is something I will pick up in the Ghost of Research Future section. In relation to the Ghost of Research Past section, Fialna et al. Also recognised that we have painted with broad brushstrokes and have failed to capture some of the nuances that are evident in the literature. We understand that by presenting examples from particular studies to illustrate certain positions, we have truncated or simplified scholars' discussions. It was this, and I suspect a chance to reflect on my own petulance regarding the positioning of my work in this paper, that led to the title and broader topic of this scholar lecture. I wanted a chance to look again at my 2010 self, my 2015 self, my 2021 self, and see not only if I could reconcile the ways in which my voice was being heard by others, but also the ways in which so many versions of myself seem to exist in the PESP research field. It feels sometimes that I am standing in a hall of mirrors or in an echo chamber and can see and hear so many versions of myself. I have to date published more than 50 research papers and feel that there must be at least that many versions of my ideas in the world. But how do I reconcile myself with those? Slightly too fast. How do others use my work while recognising the temporality of these ideas? In my preparation for this lecture, I Googled, well, Google Scholar, other search engines are available, the term Ghost of Research Past, to see if and how other authors might have used this idea in a research context. 4 papers, 2 of which were empirical, were returned with Ghost of Research Past in the title. In the first empirical paper, Mancino et al. Investigated the psychological mechanisms connecting social support to health outcomes and found no evidence from research to show that psychological factors act as mediators between social support and biological outcomes. Nevertheless, they noted that current research was focused on testing these apparent connections, despite the lack of prior evidence supporting the mediating role of psychological factors in this relationship. In the second paper, Connor reported that institutional memory of research differs quite considerably from place to place. For example, in the case of a school involved in research, the institutional memory can be as long as 25 years, as teachers recall their engagements in the events and or non-events of this research. In contrast, the institutional memory of the particular university can be much shorter, eroded it is by the demand to publish or perish and chase research funding. Both of these cases hold some resonance with my ghosts of research past. Firstly, I suspect that there is no institutional memory of my school-based research, and only very little memory of my work as a teacher in that institution. The pupils I work with are probably parents themselves, and in fact I was at a wedding yesterday and met two of them, and they're both fathers, so yes. And the lessons I taught are long forgotten. Secondly, terms like non-negotiable and benchmarks, which featured in that early research, are now absent from my work. These are just two of my ideas that deserve to be either forgotten or used with some of the caveats I talk of going forward. Model fidelity is another, and I will use this as an example of how my thinking has A, changed, and B, in my opinion, used out of context to make a point I never intended. Fidelity as an example ghost. In 2014, Peter Hastie and I published Fidelity in Models-Based Practice Research in Sport Education, a guide for future investigations, in the Journal of Teaching and Physical Education. We wrote that paper because we had repeatedly seen colleagues stating in research papers and at conferences and in conference presentations that they had done a pedagogical model such as sport education or quality learning. This was the only explanation of the model used and its use, and we felt that in doing this, colleagues were grossly underestimating the many ways in which sport education, for example, could be implemented. Given that each model has a set of givens that cannot be compromised if one is to describe a particular unit within physical education as incorporating a particular model, it becomes critical that some form of fidelity of implementation is reported. Sadly, as O'Donnell 2008 reports, fidelity of implementation is rarely reported in large-scale education studies that examine the effectiveness of key 12 curriculum interventions. The idea of fidelity of implementation we introduced in that paper has, however, been taken in directions that we did not expect. It has, for example, been used to argue that teachers are not concerned with notions such as, have I watered down the model? Have I left part of the model out? Or have I maintained fidelity to the approach? So it's running a bit slow, I'll just take it. Similarly, Susi et al. Held that some, Casey, Landy, Pill, have highlighted the confusion for teachers understanding implementing models-based practice or individual models, questioning model fidelity, and seeing evidence that of change before they would buy into the change. Indeed, in their conclusion, Susi et al. Argued that model fidelity is viewed as an all or nothing, and models-based practice becomes complicated to the teachers. This stands in contrast to our own summary that the flexibility inherent in each model allows teachers or other curriculum writers to design units of work that are suited to the specific circumstances of their local contexts. Despite what I see as the disparity between what we intended and what some literature has to say about the idea of fidelity, this is not a current view that I hold. In reading Casey and Kirk 2021, which is edited by both Pill et al., which is cited by both Pill et al. And Susi et al.'s papers, and later Bjorke and Casey, I have revisited with David and Lars my ideas about fidelity in models-based practice. In models-based practice in physical education, David and I advocated 1, a new organising centre for programme design, the pedagogical model. 2, the curriculum as specification, sustainable adaptation. 3, the external tensions, balancing local agency and external support. And 4, co-construction of physical education teachers, students and stakeholders. In doing so, we hold that a pedagogical model is always to be viewed as provisional. That agency at local levels is not merely desirable but essential to high quality physical education. And that school physical education programmes based on pedagogical models will not be constructed by teachers alone. These quotes talk directly to the notions of curriculum specification, local agency, and co-construction of physical education. and in my reading and writing of these statements diverge from the readings of the self-same work shown above. More recently, in a paper published online in September 2022, Lars and I argued for fidelity to goals as an interesting counter-perspective on fidelity proposed by McNeil et al., and held that this notion of fidelity refers to teachers doing something that might be different from the specifics of the training they receive, but still be consistent with the overarching goal of the intervention. This idea, again, as David and I did, moves away from the idea that each model has a set of specific givens that cannot be compromised. It highlights the evolution of an idea and brings me to my main argument for this Ghosts of Research Past subsection. I was taught by David in my doctoral work to return to the genesis of an idea and not rely solely on someone else's use of the work. Such an idea, used in my doctoral thesis, was used by Fernando Balboa, was the use by Fernando Balboa of the concept of poisonous pedagogies. Fernandez Balboa used this idea to represent the replication in physical education of practice that was not fit for purpose. He borrowed the term, however, from Alice Miller's book, Thou Shalt Not Be Aware. And it was only in reading the original work that I began to understand Miller's original ideas and could then apply these to my work more appropriately. I also remember David suggesting that I find the first edition of one of Stephen Kennis's books on action research because the ideas were sharper in the original than in subsequent editions. That is a mantra I followed for most of my academic career, and yet I am now given cause to question it. If we always go to the genesis of an idea, then we potentially ignore its evolution. We miss the hard thinking that has gone on in the interim. We miss what David and I call the processes of reconsideration, which is when ideas meet with practice and are potentially changed. Only by seeking to follow the evolution of an idea do we connect with ideas more fully. It is often easier to convenience quote and cherry pick ideas and find the versions of something that best fit our current thinking. This, however, does not silence the ghosts of research past. Instead, it amplifies their messages and doesn't reflect the growth or advancement in academic thinking. It also doesn't consider the social, political, and economic climate in which these ideas were born. I believe that, as a field, we need to spend more time and effort exploring the ideas that we use, or at least acknowledge the limitations of not doing so. We need to recognise when we see a research ghost, or at least recognise the possibility of such a sighting. This is, of course, somewhat of a vicious circle. Shane, Brendan and colleagues could rightfully claim that I have selectively quoted them for my own purposes, which in some ways I have. That said, and at the time of writing, and having checked their Google Scholar profiles, these seem to be the most recent publications that consider this line of thinking. It is also unfair of me to solely highlight this work, as there are other examples, and I hope that Shane, Brendan, Michael and John will forgive me for this indulgence as I explore the ideas of my research past. The ghost of research present. Come in, exclaimed the ghost. Come in and know me better, man. Scrooge entered timidly and hung his head before the spirit. He was not the dogged Scrooge he had been, and though the spirit's eyes were clear and kind, he did not like to meet them. I am the ghost of Christmas present, said the spirit. Look upon me. In looking at the ghost of research present, I feel drawn to look at current developments in the field of models-based practice and models that give me pause for thought. It is beyond the scope of this lecture to drift too far away from models. And I have chosen to talk about hybridization of models as a current idea that, in my opinion, needs unmasking. I must acknowledge, however, that hybridization is one of the ghosts of my research past, and must therefore take a modicum of credit for the proliferation of the term and the idea. In both 2009 and 2016, I lauded the idea of hybrid models. I first used the term in the study I initially wrote up for my master's dissertation, and which I presented at BERA in 2005, which then became the Journal of Teaching Physical Education publication with Ben Dyson. I think I thought I was using a hybrid model because I was using teaching gains for understanding and cooperative learning in the same unit of work. I also suspect that I felt it sounded like a cool term for such an attempt, and wanted to be someone who came up with a new concept that left a mark on the field. But I can't claim credit for that either, as I will show soon. When latterly I was invited to write a book chapter about models-based practice for the late Cathy Ennis for her Routledge handbook, I revisited the idea of hybrid models. In that piece, I tracked the origins of hybrid or dual models and took some credit, I see. The possibility of a hybrid models approach has only been suggested in the last 10 years when Alexander and Penny, Collier, Dyson et al., Dyson, and Hastie and Kirtner-Smith separately extolled the virtues of a dual model approach to teaching and physical education. However, with the exception of Casey and Dyson, me taking credit, and Hastie and Kirtner-Smith, there is little empirical research published that looks at the marriage of different models. Since then, 2 systematic reviews of hybridizing pedagogy models have been published, reviewing 20 and 17 studies respectively. This shows the proliferation of research in this area, and yet this is an aspect of my research past that still haunts me in my research present. And what better place to talk about that haunting than today? The idea of hybridization. In 2006, I was combining my substantive role as a secondary school physical education teacher with my part-time PhD at Leeds Metropolitan University, now Leeds Beckett University, and my son also studies. As many of you already know, I was supervised by David Kirk alongside Anne Campbell and Melinda Cook. And it was around this time that David started working on his seminal book, Physical Education Futures. In June of that year, I was invited to attend his inaugural lecture at Leeds Metropolitan University and then take part in a one-day conference entitled Physical Education Futures. Those in attendance at that event were among the movers and shakers of physical education and sport pedagogy research at the time, and many still are. And to say that I was a little overawed is an understatement. From memory, this was also the first time I heard David talk about his idea of physical education, or ID squared, or id squared, and I'll use lots of different versions of that as I go through. Although that might have been 2009 when I was working with him at the University of Bedfordshire, and he shared a PDF copy of the book with me. Either way, I must admit to being a little confused about ID squared. It wasn't until I started to think about my scholar lecture and my frustration with the notion of hybridization in models research that I think I finally got to grips with ID squared. Well, I hope I did, we'll see. On page 1 of his book, David refers to the idea of physical education, id squared, and suggests that id squared has remained more or less intact since around the middle of last century. It is important to note that he uses the expression more or less to account for differences in key events and moments in different countries around the world. Despite temporal and event differences, David argues that too often physical educators have spent energy struggling over ideas of physical education, and in the process, much of the time has failed to see the bigger picture, the id squared of physical education, and how it is constructed and constituted through its relationship to wider issues in society. In other words, well, in my words, and drawing on my conversations with Anne McPhail, Håkan Larsson, and Mikael Kavenestat, physical education isn't one thing. It's not a proper noun, and as such, not only does it not exist, but it is a depiction of an impression of what it should be. Just as there is no single construct that can be positioned as a chair, there is no single construct that can be positioned as physical education. There is only an idea of a chair or of physical education, and the idea I hold is probably a little different to yours. That said, if I asked you to describe a chair or physical education, then I would probably recognise your idea of the idea, or id squared, of a chair or of physical education, but would also recognise some differences. If I now apply ID squared to hybridization, and then I try to establish if I have just wasted the last 2 minutes of your life or not, if, as Anne, Håkan, Michael and I argued, there is no such thing as sport education or cooperative learning, and there is, in fact, only an idea of a sport education or of cooperative learning, then how does hybridization work? If we take the idea of sport education and mix it with the idea of cooperative learning in a so-called hybrid model, then, and in remembering my school mathematics, don't we end up with the idea of cooperative learning, of sport learning, or id to the power 4? Witticisms aside, there is a confusion here. If, as I have suggested earlier, models-based practice is characterised by curriculum specification, local agency, and the co-construction of physical education, then what might a hybrid model look like? I stuttered and that doesn't work very well. In Örebro in Sweden or in Oviedo in Spain. What does it look like if I design a unit with my background in cooperative learning, or Peter Hasty designs it with his background in sport education? Equally, doing research with hybrid models and achieving high fidelity to the critical elements is one thing, but how does a teacher develop a hybrid model? If I can find information online about sport education, teaching personal social responsibility and the activist approach, but where do I find help as a teacher with hybridization? If I search Google for a hybrid sport education model, my first 50 hits are all academic sources. Now, that may be a result of my algorithms and search histories, but I suspect there isn't much out there to help teachers with hybridizing models. I'm currently close to publishing a paper with Lars Bjorke, exploring teachers' experiences of enacting models. This systematic mixed study review has drawn on Fiala et al.'s findings about the positioning of teachers in model scholarship. Lars and I found little mention of hybrid models in the teacher data from the 91 empirical papers we reviewed, and I would proffer that isn't something teachers are thinking about doing without direct intervention from an academic or academics. Therefore, I am left to ponder if we are doing this for the PESP community or for the PE teacher profession, and challenge my colleagues to give this some consideration. Furthermore, I asked them to consider how teachers can access hybrid models and what these might look like in practice. In doing this, I asked them to consider Barry Gordon's work on hybridizing models. In 2009, Gordon asked if the joining of two models, in his case teaching personal social responsibility and sport education, was a match made in heaven or hell. He argued that tensions emerge when one model in the hybrid diverges from the other, and held that choices would have to be made which would subsequently strengthen or weaken the outcomes of one model or another. Similarly, David and I considered the nature of the hybrid that emerges from the conjoining of two individual models, and argued that true hybridization rarely occurs, but instead a composite model with two main ideas, two sets of critical elements, etc., emerges from such a union of models. In a nod to the Ghost of Research Future, but in also acknowledging that this is a present endeavour, I asked that we consider whether it's a hybrid or a composite that emerges, and which, if either, do we want? The Ghost of Research Future. Am I in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come, said Scrooge. The spirit answered not, but pointed downward with its hand. In the Ghost of Research Past section of this lecture, I foreshadow discussion yet to come regarding Verelner et al.'s acknowledgement that given the rapid development of models literature, we believe there is a need to examine how scholarship is changing and potentially providing new positions for teachers. This is something that I am increasingly drawn to do. Particularly, I'm increasingly questioning whether I have been asking the wrong questions and doing the wrong research. I'm now drawn to address the concern that if teachers can't find and discover models on their own, then pedagogical models and models-based practice isn't one of the viable futures of physical education. I'm less interested in how teachers, with the support of a researcher or research term, use a single model for 6 weeks. I'm not interested in the findings of such a study. In paraphrasing Richard Tinning when he acted as a discussant on a paper session at ARA in New Orleans in 2010, these are all nice pieces of work and are probably publishable. But why do something that we've known the answer to for 20 years? We know models work in these situations, regardless of the reported fidelity. But how do they work far from the madding crowd, as Thomas Hardy mused? In other words, far from the support and guidance of academics. When we ask questions like this, and I have asked, and will keep asking, then I think we begin to understand the multifaceted nature of a models-based practice approach and implementing multiple models across a single school curriculum. Looking at this from a distance and removing the judgment inherent in peer review, I think we open doors to different possible futures. I have been supporting a school in central England to use models-based practice across their curriculum, and they are 3 years into this venture, the results of which I hope to publish soon. I have played no part in curriculum development, and I haven't determined fidelity on a single lesson or critiqued a single lesson plan. My aim in this is to understand some of the challenges inherent in implementing models-based practice and start to consider ways in which I can support teachers going forwards. I'm also supporting Sam Faulkner, among many other PhD students, but their work isn't in models, so I apologise for them for not naming them. As he investigates the model-based practice endeavours of 5 teachers who are using models-based practice. His PhD will be finished soon, but it certainly shows some interesting findings and flags up some future directions of travel, but I won't steal his thunder here. I'm also interested in the potential whiteness and colourlessness of pedagogical models and model-based practice research, and the able-bodiedness and the Westernness and the social justiceness, or lack of such research. There has been some work done in this area, see Walton Fizet et al. 2019 around social justice, which hints at models-based practice in physical education, teacher education, but there is much more work to do. Dylan Landy and Katie Fitzpatrick warned against the adoption of health-orientated models like Spark and Hope, and suggested that such models neglect other goals of physical education, for example, addressing issues of social justice, sexism, homophobia, racism, etc. While their criticisms here are levelled at curricula that few in models-based practice research would consider pedagogical models, they have a wider point to make. We must be careful, I must be careful, not to make assumptions about what research does and doesn't do. One of the limitations Lars and I found highlighted in our systematic review, mixed study review, is the lack of distinction regarding the populations involved in models-based practice research. We could not report on key characteristics, nor how teachers and students representing diverse community engage with models. This is not something discernible in this body of research and caused me to recall the scholar lectures of Anne Flintoff, Really Useful Knowledge, Feminism, Gender and Physical Education, and Haley, Everybody Does Matter in PE, including young disabled people. These are both foci that could be better explored in models-based practice research. I also feel there is a need to be more mindful that model scholarship is predominantly a white European space. There are few, if any, people of colour in model scholarship, and we need to better understand the unique experiences of different groups in this space. Fundamentally, we need to consider the different bodies who might be impacted by our research and try and ensure that we aren't visited by our own Jacob Marley to warn of the errors of our ways. Concluding thoughts. This scholar lecture has charted a little of the journey of models-based practice research in physical education and some of the work that we have done since 2009. We have been visited by the ghosts of research past, present and future, and I find myself both emboldened by the chance to talk to you today and excited by the future. As Mary O'Sullivan said in the first scholar lecture, doing good work and contributing to the field is about consistency, commitment and flexibility. I would also add bravery to that and encourage us all, when the time is right in your career, to take the path less tread and explore some of the rabbit holes we have avoided in the past. I will live in the past and the present and the future, Scrooge repeated, And as he scrambled out of bed, the spirits of all three shall strive within me. O Jacob Marley, heaven and the Christmas time be praised. I say it on my knees, O Jacob, on my knees. In seeking to live in the past, present and future of my research, and in acknowledging the many versions of myself that seem to exist in the PESP research field, I am reminded of the need to look at both the genesis and the evolution of ideas. There are clearly many areas where ideas in models-based practice need to have their own genesis, and I welcome any ideas that colleagues may have about the next piece of research that needs to be done. Thank you for listening.